Got Larry Arnold to talk about spontaneous human combustion. And Larry, I'm sorry that we're going to have to be on the telephone, but it's an amazing subject. And I sometimes think that words have power, and the power of the mind is an incredible thing. Just before we get to Larry, let me tell you a little bit from Larry's biography here. And remembering the disclaimer that I gave you, some of this stuff is not for the kids. Some of this stuff is disturbing because it's about people catching fire and what happens after that. So please bear that in mind. Listener, viewer discretion advised. Dr. Larry Arnold is director of Parascience International, based in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The author of 4 books, including Ablaze, The Mysterious Fires of Spontaneous Human Combustion, considered by some a prominent advocate for SHC, and hence many more consider him to be a man who knows an awful lot about this stuff. Okay. Larry, can you hear me? Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yes, Howard. Hi there. Wow, we think some electrons at Zoom got combusted during the attempt to connect the two of us on both sides of the Atlantic, but we finally made it by at least by voice.
I was worried for you for a moment there, but well, you know, it's all right. You know, quite literally, not to be flippant about it, but we're going to be on fire for the next hour, metaphorically speaking. Can you define for me and my viewer and my listener what spontaneous human combustion is? It's much more than people just bursting into flames, isn't it?
It is. That's a great place to start. Our definition of the subject of spontaneous human combustion is this. It's the ability of a person's body to blister, smoke, or burn in the absence of a known, identifiable, conventional external burn agent. Historically, the subject has been defined as a body burning almost completely to powder, with perhaps a few extremities left to show that that pot of powder once had been a human being. Our research needs to broaden that concept dramatically, but that's how history has defined the subject.
Right. And a lot of people are going to be scratching their heads and saying, well, you know, I haven't really heard very much about this, and is it a thing? And more importantly, does it happen today? You know, how common is this?
To your last point first, spontaneous human combustion, or in the classic case, is what we called and labeled sudden human cremation. These events are extraordinarily rare. A person is more likely to be hit multiple times by lightning, as was Roy Sullivan, than to become a victim of sudden human cremation. Given that statement up front, the evidence that we have amassed over the years suggests that it is indeed a reality, not a myth, not a superstition, not pseudoscience, which is what mainstream science and particularly fire service investigators tend to label the topic. That's why people haven't heard much about it.
When I was a kid, my parents used to buy weekend news magazines. There were many more of these sorts of things in those days. I'm talking about like the 1970s, which is like a million years ago. I know to most people it's a historical era, but you know, sometimes we go on holiday, and if you went on holiday in the United Kingdom in the summer, it usually rained. So my mum, dad and me, I'd be sitting in the back with my toys, and they'd be sitting in the front reading news magazines. And I can remember that some of these news magazines, periodically, sensibilities were different then, weren't they, Larry? Periodically carried stories of somebody just bursting into flames and there being a pile of ash by the fireplace and a pair of slippers maybe left behind. And, you know, they would have some headline about what is the mystery of spontaneous human combustion, or, you know, spontaneous human cremation, as you might call it. You know, it was something that was more talked about back then. But there was never any discussion of it beyond, isn't this bizarre? That was about it.
Yeah, we had the same experience in this country. Our tabloid press would oftentimes headline stories about, you know, a pile of ash, perhaps a foot left behind, a forearm or a partially burned head, and calling it spontaneous human combustion. Isn't this amazing? Isn't it weird? Isn't it eerie? Isn't it frightening? Isn't it yet fantastic? But without much credible information, and so many of the cases in the tabloid press here in the United States were made-up stories, which made giving credibility to SHC all the more difficult if you're trying to talk to a firefighter or a forensic expert about the subject. However, once in a rare while, those tabloid stories proved to be absolutely 100% accurate. The challenge was differentiating what was truth from made-up fiction and mythology.
True. And look, I experienced a fire in my home in May this year. And I was by myself in my little apartment. And one thing that I realized, and I'd never thought about fire, you know, I've reported on, as a news journalist, many fires in which people luckily escaped mostly, or sadly perished, or were injured, or whatever, or suffered breathing issues as I did. What amazes you when you experience a fire and you're in one is how quickly it spreads. So a lot of people who try and debunk the tales of spontaneous human combustion say, well, you know, it's just one of those things because fire spreads quickly, and clearly the fire just engulfed the armchair that the person was sitting in, and then either extinguished itself or was somehow extinguished. But it's merely a product of the fact that fire, and like I say, believe me when I say this if you haven't experienced it, fire progresses quickly. So you can understand, I think, can you, Larry, how some people would say, well, it's just it's an unfortunate accident, but because fire goes woof and consumes whatever is in its path and then sometimes extinguishes itself or somebody puts it out, you know, that can explain why it's localized in that way.
Superficially, that can explain many fire fatalities if one doesn't think deeply about the particular fire scene. Thousands of people, unfortunately, die every year around the world through smoking mishaps, mostly dropped cigarettes or pipe embers that fall upon one's clothing. The problem with, as you correctly say, normally fire spreads quite quickly. But those who say SHC is an impossibility argue that the victims of wholly immolated people can be explained by the wick effect, which they say is a very slow burning, low heat, smoldering fire, not a rapid fire progression at all. If that were the case, even, we would expect to see hundreds, if not thousands, of almost wholly ashen bodies every year around the world. If this was the common sensical, prosaic explanation for these, what we say are rare SHC events. We don't find that evidence.
Can you think of a famous case that exhibited precisely what you've just been talking of? Where there was an apparent slow burning process that then progressed into something else and then left the person as the tabloid newspaper pile of ash.
Yeah. Can off the top of her head give you a slow burning fire that evolved into a wholly ashen body. We can give you many examples from the research that we've done over 40 some years of bodies that have burned almost completely to dry powder, and yet surrounding combustibles like furniture, stacks of newspaper, plastic draped cloths, and furniture escape without significant or even without any heat or flame damage to them. One case would be Mary Reeser from here in here in Florida in 1951, Dr. Bentley here in our home state of Pennsylvania in 1966, Jane Lamperter, who was a British resident who cremated herself in Cheltenham in the early 1800s, George Mott, a retired firefighter in upstate New York in 1986, and we can go on from there. Pick a case, we'll detail it for you.
The Mary Reeser case, this was, as you say, in Florida. She burned into a pile of ash, but the apartment around her, and this is the great enigma here, suffered almost no damage, which led to theories that she had spontaneously combusted, because how else could that have happened in that way?
Indeed, the Reeser case that happened in July 1 or July 2 overnight in 1951 in St. Pete, Florida, is the case that introduced us to this subject and raised some interesting questions for us at the time, and raised a lot of interesting questions for the investigating authorities in St. Petersburg, Florida, back in 1951. She was burned. About a 170-pound woman was incinerated overnight to about 8 pounds of ashen rubble that consisted of 1 foot inside an unburned satin slipper, a few pieces of calcined vertebrae, a head that was alleged at the time to have shrunken to the size of a grapefruit or teacup. The chair on which she was known to be seated last had immolated, was part of that rubble, as was an end table next to that chair. Beyond basically a 3-foot circle in diameter, nothing significantly had burned in her apartment in St. Pete. We were down there a couple of weeks ago. We've been to the apartment building. We met again with officials from the St. Pete Fire and St. Pete Police Departments, and we managed also to talk to the son of one of the two firemen who shoveled out her ashes from her apartment in 1951. The son told us that his father kept describing the case as weird, bizarre. We also interviewed the other firefighter who shoveled up her ashes, Nelson Aders, and he told us that in his professional firefighting viewpoint, she was a victim of spontaneous human combustion.
Well, isn't that interesting? Because those are the views of people who see tragedy firsthand every day. You know, my father was a police officer. He had to do those things, and emergency service workers do those things so that you don't have to. We have an image here, Larry, that we're going to show, but I just want to say before we show you this image that it is disturbing, and if you are disturbed by such things, please look away now. This is the image. And that image, I believe, is at the bottom screen there. So it's not as, I'm not sure whether we can zoom in on that. But that is, that's the image. And I know that, Larry, you can't see this, but it is a most disturbing image of effectively a pile of human rubble. That's it, really. So those people who you interviewed, who you spoke with, did they talk to you about the chronology of how the timeline, that's the word, the timeline of how they came to the conclusion that there was nothing else that this could be but spontaneous human combustion?
Right, an excellent question, because the time factor in these cases is of utmost importance. As we said earlier, those who debunk SHC, those who say that this is superstition, myth, absolutely impossible, pseudoscience, argue that these are long-duration, low-temperature fires lasting several hours. So the time factor, if we're going to look at SHC or sudden human cremation, becomes absolutely crucial to try to lock down. In the case of Helen Conway from here in Pennsylvania back in 1964, we know from interviewing the three senior fire officials on duty that day who responded to the fire that burned up Mrs. Conway in her second-floor apartment outside of Philadelphia in 1964. From the time they got the fire alarm called in to the time that they arrived to a fire scene in which there was no fire to put out was, according to the officials on record, no more than 21 minutes. But in sitting down with the fire photographer, who later became fire marshal for Upper Darby Township, Bob Meslin, he was able to tighten that window even more snugly. So from the time that she was known to be alive until the victim was discovered burned in a fire that did not have to be extinguished was only 360 seconds. Six minutes. Gee.
So that's not a slow burn then. That is a dramatic effect.
That's not a slow burn. That's very dramatic, yeah. We also have eyewitness cases, one from England, happened in Lambeth outside or part of London back in 1967, if memory serves. Yes, September 13, 1967. The victim's name was Robert Bailey. He was a derelict, known to the local police as a vagrant and an alcoholic. He was discovered by Jack Stacy, the fire brigade commander, and his crew that morning of September 13th, dead, lying face sideways with his jaw embedded in a mahogany newel post in a tenement building. What's important about that case to us, among many other aspects, is that Mr. Stacy told us that he and his crew, when they arrived on the scene, saw a blue flame jetting with force from the abdomen of Mr. Bailey. They attempted to extinguish that blue flame with several fire extinguishers. Finally were successful. They looked, obviously, for scenes of evidence of foul play. They looked for evidence of an accelerant. They looked for an external source of the fire. They could find nothing. As Jack Stacy told us as we sat down to interview him face-to-face several years ago, this fire originated inside and burned outward.
My apologies to my
spontaneous human combustion.
My apologies to my listener, my viewer. These details are gruesome, especially the description of how those flames emanated seemingly from the body. But that's what we're talking about here. We're going to hope to get him in pictures in just a second from now. I'm going to take some commercials here at the Unexplained at TalkTV. We're talking with Larry E. Arnold on the subject of either spontaneous human combustion or sudden human cremation. The initials are the same. The definition of each initial is different in those two cases. It's fascinating. It is a little disturbing, though. In spontaneous human combustion, some of the detail that we've been giving you, of course, is difficult to digest. And if you don't like this kind of thing, then I think you've got to close your ears and eyes for the next 10 minutes or so. Larry, thank you very much. I'm sorry that I kept you waiting there. That's the front page of your updated book, Ablaze. One of the things that you highlight in the book is that the UK seems to have been a bit of it's an unfortunate turn of phrase, but I can't think of another word. The UK is a bit of a hotspot for this. It seems to have happened here in terms of, amount of geographical territory. The number of cases is perhaps greater than other countries. Why do you think that is?
That is what our research has revealed to us, and the reasons we believe are probably multifold. One, your press likely presents the evidence of these fire scenes more accurately in print, more detailed in print than do the media sources here in the United States and elsewhere. So for a researcher like ourselves, it's easier to find the odd aspects of these fires that leads us then to, pursue an investigation further. We also have a sense that your neck of the world has some interesting telluric energies. Surely some of your listeners are aware that the megalithic sites that span the UK, many of them align, and we think a similar phenomenon happens with the data that we have acquired for cases of sudden human cremation and other fire anomalies. What we did back in 1975, because we had so many examples of anomalous fires in the UK, was to plot those locations on a map. And what we discovered was that more than 80% of our database for cases in the UK could be connected by alignments. One alignment particularly that roughly parallels the east coast of the UK from down in Sussex up into Aberdeen, Scotland, may connect as many as a dozen anomalous fires. And now, statistically, that we find to be intensely and hugely significant and points to the possibility of a factor that's geographic or geologic or telluric that causes property and people who are in the wrong place at the wrong time to suddenly ignite. Inexplicably.
Can you just define again for me that word telluric?
Telluric is earth-centered, earth-based energy.
So what, electromagnetic?
Something along that line, probably, yes. Mm-hmm. But something that mainstream geophysicists don't yet recognize and cannot quantify.
Mm. You talked about the case from the United Kingdom, who, and again, these details are gruesome, but apparently had blue flame shooting from his stomach area, his abdomen, which is a particularly disturbing thing. I mean, that would suggest to me, if this thing happens, then we know that our gut, we've all felt it, we've all had to take, medicine for it occasionally, but our gut is full of gas. Now, I would guess, and obviously, some people produce more methane than others. Not to put too fine a point on it, methane is a gas that ignites. Could that be involved?
It may be involved in a few cases, yes. But once again, we're puzzled by what is the ignition source that would ignite the methane in one's gastrointestinal tract to cause a blue flame. And again, because the witness cases that we have been able to document throughout history most often speak of a blue-colored fire or flame that engulfs or emanates from the victim's body. This tells us that we're not dealing with a normal oxidizing type of combustion, what you get when you strike a match, for example, or light a gas burner on an oven. We're dealing with some other kind of energy, biochemical or bioelectrical, or as we alluded to earlier with the cartography of combustion, telluric energy, something in the planet.
Now, one of my listeners has just pointed out a very good point here, clearly studied science, but a blue flame indicates complete combustion of the gas. In other words, this was a process that by the time those people, the emergency crews, got there and saw what they saw, this was a process that was fully underway, was completely consuming.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
could well be that. Blue flame also normally indicates a very high temperature combustion event.
And again, how could that happen within somebody's home? How could you get to those kind of temperatures?
That's one of the big puzzlements of the phenomena that you and we were discussing this evening. Case in point, we sent you the photograph of Dr. John Irving Bentley, a retired physician whose home state was also ours here in Pennsylvania. This was the case after we read about Mary Reeser's sudden immolation down in St. Pete back in 1951. When we discovered the Bentley case in the mid-1970s and saw the photograph, it completely changed our life's trajectory at this point. We're no longer looking at perhaps a one-off with Mrs. Reeser, but we're looking at similar cases that just consume the body in an environment and a situation that makes no logical scientific sense. We're looking at a fire that presumably would have a temperature hotter than a crematorium retort operates at. So we're talking 22, 24, 2600 degrees Fahrenheit. In often cases, a combustible tinderbox of an environment, and yet there is no heat or flame damage feet above where the body burned itself. We're looking at what appears to be a very localized, intense fire, and yet one that does not produce the anticipated, expected flame and heat damage that one would expect to find at a normal, conventional, fatal fire scene. And that's what leaps out to us and should pose serious questions to anyone who looks at the data that we have collected in our book Ablaze. These are not typical human fire fatalities. These are something that is completely bizarre, eerie, frightening, and yet scientifically should be so fascinating because it cries out for understanding and further research.
But so few people are doing it. We've only got literally 1 minute. One of my texters, one of my viewers tonight says, as regards spontaneous human combustion, there are 7.5 billion people on this planet, so why has it never been witnessed? Why is it always people on their own? I think that's a big generalization, but, you know, just give me an idea why that is, why it's such a solitary thing.
Yeah, it's also an incorrect observation because, as we said with the case of Robert Bailey, these cases have been witnessed around the world, and as we said, most often the witnesses see a bright electric blue-colored fire or energy that engulfs the victim.
Larry, I'm sorry that I've got to wrap it up now. Television is a medium that consumes time, unfortunately, and we had some technical problems with the connection, but thank you so much. Larry Arnold's book is called Ablaze. It is about a disturbing topic, spontaneous human combustion, the kind of thing that we talk about here late at night on this show called The Unexplained. Thank you to you for being part of this. And from London, my name is Howard Hughes. Good night.
This is TalkTV.
Just when I was getting used to my show, what just happened?